Welcome to the lecture on the second half of Chapter 9 for Psychology 150, General Psychology. Today I'm going to talk about emotions. There are really complex theories about emotion, but all of them understand that emotion is an automatic response to specific events, that it reflects an underlying unconscious process that causes us to have reactions in three domains. Physically, our physiology may speed up. Cognitively, we think certain things. And behaviorally, we act or change our appearance in certain ways. We can contrast emotions as being either primary or secondary. Primary emotions are those that seem to appear in all cultures for all people, and they are easily identifiable for most of us, regardless of who is expressing them. Things like anger, fear, sadness, disgust, happiness, probably surprise, and maybe contempt. Secondary emotions are blends of these. They're more than one of these primary emotions occurring together, and those are much more culturally determined. Things like remorse, shame, that really depends on the kinds of actions or behaviors that are shameful or embarrassing in a particular culture. When we think about an emotional state which is drawn out, which is not specific to a particular event in the environment, this is a mood. These are longer lasting, and they don't necessarily have to be associated with a particular event. One way to categorize emotion is to think about them along two dimensions. One is how positive or negative the emotion is, and the second is how much physiological arousal is involved. For example, a relatively unaroused, calm emotion is somewhat positive and has very little sympathetic nervous system arousal. A really positive emotion that is also highly activating the sympathetic nervous system is excitement or happiness. And the flip side is also true. Lethargic, depressed are negative emotions, but they don't have a lot of physiological arousal, whereas nervousness and stress do. There are three classic theories about how emotions are formed. One of these is the James Lange theory, which goes back to the work of William James. This is the idea that there's an event, there's a stimulus in the environment, your body responds to it in some way, and then you feel the emotion. So there's a problem with this in that it doesn't specify which emotion is attributable to which physiological state. But there is some support for this in the facial feedback hypothesis. This is something that goes back to the 1960s with Tompkins. And the idea behind the facial feedback hypothesis is that we get sensory feedback from the way our face is shaped, and that tells us something about the emotion that we're feeling. This was tested in 1974 in the classic experiment by Laird. He had people hold a pencil between their teeth or above the lips in a frown, and found that people expressed emotions that were consistent with the smile or frown that they were holding in their face. So you were getting some feedback from the body, and it told you what emotion you were feeling. The Cannon-Bard theory suggests that both the physiology and the emotional feeling, the labeling of the emotion, happens simultaneously but through distinct separate pathways. That is, there's a stimulus, one part of the brain says, oh my goodness, that's a bear, I'm afraid. Another part of the stimulus says, unconsciously, raise up sympathetic arousal, we need to get away from the bear. A fairly complete theory is Schachter and Singer's two-factor theory. In this theory, the physiology comes first and the label that we put on it comes second. So we have an automatic, unconscious physiological response, and then we look around for, consciously, some stimulus that would explain that and label the emotion based on the stimulus that we see or perceive. So one test of this involved the what's called misattribution of arousal. You can see in the figure in the bottom there. This is a recreation of part of the experiment. Researchers stationed an attractive female research assistant on one of two bridges, one of which was a swinging bridge like this, and another was a more stable bridge that didn't move. And as young men approached, she would ask them to participate in a survey that had nothing to do really with the experiment. It was simply a ruse to get their attention. And so at the end of the survey, she said, well, if you have any questions, here's the number to call me and you can ask about that later. What happened was the people on the stable bridge, almost none of them called. The people on the swinging bridge, a large percentage of them called. And the explanation was that the fear that they felt in the swinging bridge, they misattributed to attraction to the research assistant. So the takeaway from that is, if you want somebody to like you, take them on a scary date, because they'll interpret fear as attraction by seeing you rather than what's actually causing them to be afraid. Interestingly, people will often describe certain emotions as having warm or cold feelings, and they'll describe this as happening in parts of their body. People will talk about anger as being, just red hot rage in their face. And so this graph is a representation of average responses from a number of people about the heat or coolness they feel in their body when they're experiencing particular emotions. The amygdala, that small almond-shaped structure on the end of the hippocampus, is crucial for interpreting the emotional significance of events in the world. And there's sort of two ways that the information gets to the amygdala. The first way is this kind of unconscious rapid path where it goes directly from the sensory systems to the amygdala. And this results in an immediate feeling of emotion. And the second way involves going through the thalamus and then to the cortex, allowing for a more nuanced and deliberate evaluation of the situation, leading to a more reasoned approach to the emotion. So you can think about, here's the visual information coming in, and some of it goes directly to the amygdala, and this results in an automatic, immediate response. This can be overridden by the second system, which takes longer because it goes through the thalamus and then to the cortex and then to the amygdala. Within the amygdala itself, there are actually two areas, nuclei, which is sort of a bundle of cells, that are especially important for determining emotional responses. The lateral nucleus, this is on the side, obviously, of the amygdala, is what links the environmental stimulus to the physiological response. In some people, this is very sensitive, and they respond to things others don't even notice. So the degree to which an individual scans the environment for threats, notices those threats, and reacts to them is determined by the size and activity of this lateral amygdala. And that functioning is determined partially by inborn genetically based differences and partially by the experiences that we have. People who have experienced a great deal of trauma will have an especially overactive lateral amygdala and will notice and respond to, they'll be triggered by things much more easily than folks who have not. In the middle of the amygdala, the central nucleus, is what activates the motor responses to fear. And again, these are both part of the unconscious immediate system and the more deliberative system. So in some people, this central nucleus is overreactive. It's larger, it's more easily stimulated, and their response to a potentially fearful or threatening situation is much stronger and much more elevated than in other people. So there's really two parts of this that are going on. One is the lateral nuclei, which determine whether you're going to detect something. Then the central nuclei, which determine how you're going to respond. And so those two parts act both immediately. So there's a stimulus and the response you have is unconscious, uncontrollable, immediate. And then there's a more deliberative part that takes a split second longer, where you can make a more reasoned interpretation of the information. But again, still, some people are going to be triggered to respond to events that other people won't be, and some people's responses are going to be stronger than for other people. So what is it that happens if you have damage to the amygdala? There are particular diseases that lead to the degradation of the amygdala. And for those people, they're unable to develop fear to environmental stimuli. You see the two lines there, A on top. This is someone who's been conditioned to respond to an electric shock with fear. So there's a tone or a light comes on, there's a shock, and the person learns, they become fearful when they hear the tone of the light. The patient without a functioning amygdala doesn't ever learn that. People like that never are able to determine how dangerous situations are. They can't learn about the environment that way. And so they tend to do things that are fairly risky, like approach complete strangers, even when it's a bad idea to do so. They also have a difficult time detecting emotions by reading other people's faces. For example, people with damage to the amygdala can't tell which of these two figures looks more trustworthy. And so our ability to kind of learn about the environment and read other people's emotions depends on the amygdala as well. So what do we do to try to deal with our emotional states? There are a couple of things that people try. One is don't think about it, thought suppression. Which works great in the short term, but terrible in the long term, because eventually you get a rebound effect. Rumination is just thinking about it, thinking about it, thinking about it. That doesn't seem to work really well in the long term either. One thing that has some success is what's called positive reappraisal. This is thinking about the feelings that we're having and trying to view them in a more objective, neutral way. One thing that sometimes happens when people say are ruminating on an emotion or ruminating on an event is that they tend to think it's worse and worse and worse, and their appraisal of the situation gets more and more negative. So positive reappraisal is one of the cognitive therapy techniques where people learn to look at this in a more objective way as a way to reduce their own unpleasant emotions. Another thing that works really well is humor. Laughter is incredibly good for you. It releases all kinds of endorphins, which are the pain-killing hormones, dopamine, serotonin. Our pain perception goes down. It's extremely good for you. A beneficial short-term strategy is distraction. Getting yourself to think about something else. So if you're in a bad mood, doing something you enjoy, this is usually very good. It can sometimes go wrong when we start, instead of thinking about the current problem, start thinking about something else. But in general, distracting yourself is a good way to reduce those emotions, those negative emotions. So if you think about how we have this sort of immediate reaction, if you get into a pattern or a cycle where you're thinking about bad things, breaking that cycle can be very positive in terms of reducing those negative feelings. So let's look at some of the ways that our emotions are useful to us, that we can use them to improve our lives. Emotions weren't really studied for a long time in human history. One of the first people was Charles Darwin, who is, I guess, more well known for other work. But he suggested that emotions are conserved behaviors, or emotional expression are conserved behaviors. This is how animals communicate. If you think about dogs, when their tails are wagging or when they're snarling, you get different information from them. And he suggested that we do that too. We need context, though. If you look at these two pictures, the face is exactly the same in both of those. But in the first one, most people interpret that A as being sadness and B as being fear, even though the facial features are exactly the same. So having a disconnect between the body language and the facial expressions can make it difficult to interpret what people are feeling. For some of the primary emotions, there's evidence that people, this is Paul Ekman's research, people everywhere around the world are able to see facial expressions of these emotions and interpret what they mean, regardless of where they grew up, that this is sort of innate in humans. Ekman is the basis for the TV show Lie to Me. So if you look at all these people from different cultures, they all are expressing happiness. Some of these things are more easy to determine than others. Pride seems to be innate. If you look at both of these people, these are people who have just won a judo match, and the expression of pride is the same on both of them. They're smiling, their arms are up. They're pushing out their chest. And this is not something you necessarily learn by watching people because the man on the right is blind from birth and therefore has never seen anyone do this. Display rules are the culturally determined standards for how different people are supposed to respond in different emotional situations. So there are different rules for adults and children, in most cultures for men and women. And some cultures are very expressive, and some cultures are much more reserved for the same emotions. The caricature here is that there's a sad movie on, and the woman's allowed to cry, and the man is not. And in American society, women are permitted to express sadness. It's socially acceptable for them to do that, more so than for men. Men, on the other hand, in the United States, are typically permitted to express anger more directly than are women. Emotions can actually help us with cognitive processes as well. So we use our mood to help us make decisions, even if the mood's unrelated to the decision. So, for example, one of the ways that the car dealer here is trying to sell the car is by putting the customer in a good mood, being friendly, offering them something to drink. People, when they feel good, are more likely to interpret that as, this is a good time to buy a car. This is a good. I'm in a good mood. Must be the car that's making me feel like this. Related to this is the idea that we use emotions to predict how we're going to feel later. If we think about different choices and think about how we might feel if we do each of those things, this can guide us as to which choice is the better one for us. So, for example, if you think about going to school for 100 years to be a microneurosurgeon, how are you going to feel after that, as opposed to going to school for 11 years to be a macroneurosurgeon? It can help you to make decisions about which of those two career paths you might want to take. Our judgments are even affected by moods. That is, people in good moods tend to rate everything around them better than when the same people are in a bad mood. So if you ask people to rate, say, their satisfaction with their life, on days they're in a good mood, they're going to give that a higher rating than on days when they're in a bad mood, even though their overall satisfaction is probably not much different between those 2 days. We tend to think of guilt as a negative emotion, as an unpleasant thing. And in fact, it is. But it has some really important social aspects. Guilt is what helps maintain social bonds. When people violate a rule in their society, even if they don't get caught and they feel guilty, this helps to maintain the cohesion in the society. It helps to get people to follow the rules that they're supposed to follow. And this really depends on socialization. What you've learned is the appropriate behavior and how you should feel if you violate that. So, in some societies, there's a great deal of guilt that's involved in training children to follow particular rules. And there are some kinds of behaviors that are induce, and we're taught to induce, really strong feelings of unpleasantness. In other societies, there's less of that, and people's behavior varies accordingly. Finally, embarrassment is when we have violated some social norm, and people know about it, And we blush, we look down, we feel bad about ourselves. Mark Twain famously said, "Man is the only animal that blushes or needs to." Okay, thank you. I hope that's been good. I will see you all on Thursday for the test. Take care.